All right. And then we just have a wee minute while it feeds through. All right. And then we just have a wee minute while it feeds through. All right. Hello, you two. Hi, Jamie. Hi, Lydia. Hi, everyone who is watching online. Welcome to this Lighthouse event to celebrate troublemaking. It is such a treat to have you both here tonight with us in this virtual room to talk about a really important, really galvanizing, energizing, slightly terrifying book. And so our format tonight is going to be to give each of them a chance to tell you a little bit more about the book. And then I'm going to ask some questions. And then you're going to have a chance to ask some questions. And then, and if you have any thoughts or experiences that you've had relating to work or trade unions, then do, chuck them in the chat too. I'm going to give them each a brief introduction, and then we will move on to the two of you. So Jamie works for a university and is a researcher based in London. He's a member of two unions, the IWGB and UCU. He supports new worker organising through the IWGB General Members Branch and the Organise Now project. Jamie is the author of books including Working the Phones, Marx at the Arcade, as well as an editor of Notes from Below and Historical Materialism. Lydia is a workplace organizer. She was the head of organising at IWGB until 2021. She has been involved in organising with foster care workers, food delivery, couriers, cycling instructors, cleaners, security guards, and game workers. She now supports socialist education initiatives and is active as a union member. She is an editor at Notes from Below and Red Pepper. So there could be few less qualified human beings to tell us about trade unions. So shall I hand over to you, Lydia?
Great, thank you so much. Just to reiterate, thank you so much for having us on. It's amazing to be here, even virtually, and speak to you all. And just to reiterate the point that you've already mentioned, we love doing these meetings because we love hearing from people organising at work or people not organising at work up and down the country, and would love to hear your experience, what you've been up to, whether it's gone well, whether it hasn't, and any questions you have or challenges to anything we say. That would be great. So first, I'm going to talk a little bit about why we wrote the book, and then a small bit about the content as well. So quite simply, the book puts forward a strategy for us as socialists, as communists, to build power and then to wield that power. And we see the way to do that, the vehicle for that, as organising in our workplaces. Just to give you a bit of my background, for many years I was an activist, saw myself as one of those kind of hardcore activists, always searching for a way to build power. Build power in the way that I understood it is to force your opponent to do something that they probably don't want to do. And as an activist, I marched, occupied, squatted, but fundamentally always felt pretty powerless. I think this is probably something we can all relate to if we've been involved in any politics or political activism. Mm-hmm. I always knew that marching from kind of A to B in central London wasn't really tipping the balance of power in a substantial way. And I think we can relate to this also in the workplace. Many of us want the power to change the world, but have this incredibly disempowering experience every day when we go to work, when we barely have control over our own workplace, let alone power to change the world as a result of our organising there. So to my kind of shame, really, I didn't come to union organising through my own workplace. I was a student when I got connected with some cleaners at my university just by chance on Facebook. Totally dates the story now. But 3 cleaners had been sacked from my university and they were just looking for solidarity. they asked me to write to the university management and act outraged, like be an outraged student and tell the university that it was totally unacceptable. The university got back to me and said, of course, we'll meet with you immediately. As a fee-paying student, we must. I was quite surprised by this, but ended up going along with 10 others, a bit of an angry mob that we got together of the sacked cleaners, other students, other supporters. And very quickly, these cleaners were reinstated. From there, Beverly, who was just the most fiercest union organizer, recruited dozens of other cleaners in a matter of weeks. We used to have these incredible 15-minute union meetings. There was only ever 15 minutes between shifts, so when everyone could be in a meeting. And it was very early in the morning. It was a really weird time. But we would go to a canteen where the cleaners had been told they weren't allowed to eat their lunch. It was only for students. It was very shiny and brand new, probably cost them millions. But we would have our meetings there. And because we just had these 15 minutes, they were quite to the point. The cleaners knew that to win the parity of conditions with the in-house staff that they wanted, so the better sick pay, better pensions, better pay, they would have to go on strike. They knew that nothing else would shift the dial in the way that they needed to. So we would finish these 15-minute meetings and everyone would be banging their fists on the table, shouting strike, 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 which was incredible. And so obviously we planned these days of strike action. The picket lines were loud and disruptive, but there was also face painting and Zumba classes. And we just twinned it with lots of other disruptive action too, like, you know, encouraging speakers to pull out of events, disrupting meetings. And on kind of one day, we really didn't expect it. The university called in the cleaners and told them that they weren't just, you know, giving in to all their demands, giving them parity of conditions with the in-house staff, but they were going to end the practicing of outsourcing entirely. The cleaners were going to go from being employed by a third company to being employed directly by the university. And this represented huge improvements in pay, conditions, pensions, sick pay, something that was really important to the cleaners. And I start with this story, even though it's kind of maybe the pinnacle of what a union campaign can look like. And most union work is actually quite boring and day to day, because I think it gives us a story of hope that we really need right now. If a group of workers who for like years have been seen as unorganisable can do it, it can force a massive institution to bend to their will. And it shows the power of organising at work. And through my work with the IWGB, I saw this same process again and again and again. A group of workers saying, oh, it's not possible, we couldn't possibly do this, we're up against it, we're up against all the odds, and then winning time and time again. And why we felt the need to bring this message of hope in the book by talking about all these incredible stories was we conceived of it at a time when there wasn't much hope around. It was a time when there had been so many new horizons, like Bernie in the US, Corbyn in England, and very kind of brutally and quickly these horizons were dashed with the defeat of Corbynism in England and Bernieism, I don't know how we call that, in the US. So many great activists and organisers overnight went from having this kind of route to power or way of understanding the world and how they were going to change the world, just completely dashed. I'd love to hear in the comments if there was a similar situation in Scotland as well and what your experience of that has been. I think also connecting with that, there's been this amazing rise of young people who've come to politics through climate politics, through school strikes, who also are looking for that analysis of how can they change the world, how can they build power. And so through the book, we try and connect these workplace struggles to this broader socialist fight for a better future. And we do this by arguing that as socialists, we must organise by a set of shared principles. It's not enough just to say, oh, join a union, organise at work. Actually, we must be doing that organising in a very specific way through a set of shared principles. Our first principle we discuss is action. Taking action is important to win. The next is a kind of a shared rank and file politics, something that Jamie's going to touch on in his talk. Importance of kind of building a strong presence at the base of your union. And then lastly, democracy. Democracy is an important tool of organising. So to kind of touch on democracy first, obviously democracy is an ideal in of itself, it's important to uphold. But in the book, we discuss democracy as a practical necessity to win in our workplace and for a wider kind of socialist change as well. By building a campaign that's democratic, with an active and mass support, we are far more likely to win. As soon as we see democracy, and we see this all the time in the union movement, as just a tick box exercise, we need to do our union elections, do a motion, that kind of thing, and not as an active process, we lose some of our leverage. We're not going into battle with all the tools that we need. And we also discuss democracy as this essential building block for building socialism. Without democracy in our campaigns, we can't build our own networks of power. Whilst obviously winning a campaign is really important, making material gains is really important, how we actually build that campaign is what will prepare us to collectively overthrow capitalism. And in a kind of very practical example, if we build a campaign with a few very capable people running a campaign on behalf of others, we're not going to be building a movement. We're not going to be building the leaders that we need. And it's definitely something I've been guilty of in the past, rushing ahead and not checking that people are right behind you. And then finally, just to finish talking briefly about action. Simply, action is how we win. For too long, the union movement has parroted this idea that strike action is something we don't want to do and that it's our last resort. Whereas in reality, taking action builds our power and our confidence. A very basic point, but something we always have to come back to. It's how we reveal the power we do have, that power that we've built. And it's how we win. It's how we win big. I'll leave it at that and pass over to you, Jamie.
Thank you so much for that, Lydia.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Lydia. And yeah, I just want to say it's really nice to come and speak even virtually at Lighthouse Books. I launched one of my other books at Lighthouse in person, and it's really excellent bookshop. And we need more places where we can go and buy radical literature and come and have talks like this. So yeah, really pleased to be here. I just want to say a couple of things really to introduce the book from my side. I want to say a couple of things about work and why we focus on work in the book. And then I want to say a couple of things about what we mean by rank and file politics. So what the kind of politics behind the book is. But also to say, why write a book like this? Why now? Hopefully there's an answer to this. Otherwise, the book launch is going to really go off a cliff. But this is the kind of book that both Lydia and I wished we could have had to read to think about the politics of organising at work when we first started. Now, there are lots and lots of books, and I'm sure Lighthouse stocked them as well, on the kind of how to do organising at work. How to organise a union meeting. How to navigate some of these challenges that we're facing in the workplace. And really, this book is not intended to be a kind of how to, but much more about why we should do this, the politics behind it, why, if you want to change the world, you should be concerned about trade union meetings and organising with your colleagues, to kind of make that argument that we've pieced together through our time organising in different unions and in different campaigns. So to try and take a bit of a step back. And that leads into the three things that I want to say about work and why I think it's important. The first, and it's a Friday night, so maybe people have had the whole experience of this all week, but work is necessarily antagonistic in its relationships. And what I mean by this is there's an economic antagonism at work that most of us have no other way to survive than by selling our time to somebody else. And that brings us into a different set of interests with people who are running where we work. Is most of us want to have some energy left over at the end of the day. We want to be able to go and enjoy our weekend. We don't want to work hard all of the time. But people who employ us want to get the most out of the time they're buying from us. So it pushes us into conflict in the workplace. And I think, this is one of the constants of work, right? We look back at work over the last couple of 100 years. What's the thing that keeps coming up is that, people don't like this experience and try to find some way to do something about it. The second point is that work brings us into contact with other people with shared interests. Think about all the people you've met in the different jobs you've done, the kinds of bonds you can form in the workplace with other people. Might have different backgrounds, different kinds of experiences, but when you come and work together in the same place, you have this kind of shared experience and shared sense of what your struggles could do together. Winning a pay rise together, winning improvements together. These are things that can be shared with other people. The third point I want to make is that these struggles at work, whilst I'm sure many of us want a pay rise, many of us want better conditions, they do much more than just have the potential for small economic gains. They can also give us a glimpse of what another way of organising society could look like. Our struggles at work have to be collective. I'm never going to win anything at the university I'm in fighting on my own, although I have tried at various points to do that. When we fight to change things and we fight to take control of our workplace, as Lydia says, it's not just about economics, but it's also about a democratic struggle. Why are we going to work? Who are we working for? What are we doing while we're there? But also when we go on strike, when we organize these campaigns, we have to find new ways to cooperate. Think about the processes we go through in union meetings and so on. These become a kind of collective experience of running our own campaigns, of finding ways to organize against the boss, that are a kind of collective learning experience that is part of the preparation for struggles beyond the workplace. And this is a point that we really try and get across in the book, that the process of organizing and the process of going through struggle is an important dynamic. We learn things, even if we get things wrong, which some of us have got things wrong in workplace campaigns. This is part of building that collective power and confidence to change the world. But one of the common pitfalls that many people have probably come across or had the experience of is joining a union and then finding that things don't quite go how you wanted to in a union. And in the book, we talk about this in terms of a rank and file approach to organizing. As unions grow and they get bigger, they start to develop a specialized staff often. They have people who are paid out of union dues, people who are not going back into the workplace. And they can begin to form a kind of separate layer of interest in organizations. Union officials want the union to do well, otherwise they're probably not going to be re-elected or re-employed. But ultimately, what many union officials want is a resolution to disputes. Not to be on strike forever. That's a lot of work for union officials, but instead to find ways to get back to negotiating, to find a deal and get people back to work. And so what we talk about in the book is often, and in many of the unions that people are in, may have had this experience of having to fight both the employer, but also having to fight the union to say, we can do this. It is possible to win this. And so we talk about this rank and file approach of thinking about how we as rank and file members, as people who aren't paid by union subs, can build pressure to force union leaderships to do the sorts of things that we want them to do. And I think we can see a bit of this in the strike wave that's happened over the last year or so, which, you know, is a nice time to be publishing a book about organising and strikes when lots of them are happening around. But it's to think about how many unions that haven't been on strike or haven't had these experiences in recent years have felt this huge pressure from below to do something about the cost of living crisis. But at the same time, many of these union leaders also face huge pressure from above, from the employers, from the state, from the media. And, you know, we've seen a lot of bad deals being pushed through as people kind of buckle under that pressure. And so we talk about a number of examples in the book of ways you can try to build rank and file power, thinking about the importance of democracy, as Lydia's talked about, and about taking action, to think about how we can independently engage in these union struggles and try to see that the union itself isn't the horizon that we're talking about. You know, we're talking about building confidence of ourselves, of other workers, to think about the kind of struggles that we can be involved in. And for me, that's the thing that's really exciting about organising at work. You know, it's not the same as just going on a protest. It's about building those collective capacities, because, you know, if we look over the next few months or the next few years, there's a lot of things on the horizon that, you know, are frankly quite terrifying. And our argument is that what you should do is get into the workplace, start organising, and have that bigger horizon about how all of us, starting from the workplace, can change society for the better. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that. You know, I said galvanizing, but there is something in the book that you really do make a compelling case for the workplace as this starting point for those broader routes to power, which has been clearly so effective recently in sort of, you know, people getting what they need over the last year in a way that other pressure from political parties and all the rest of it hasn't shifted the dial. I wanted to sort of start by sort of asking, you know, one of the obvious questions around, you know, not joining a union and the people who decide that they can't or they won't, and the people, you know, you write brilliantly about this idea of the too precarious worker, who, you know, for many years we've been told is too precarious to join a union, that it isn't possible. And so I wanted to ask you that question twofold. One is, why are so many people caught up in this idea that they can't join a union or won't, or that the unions won't solve their problems? The sort of history of that feeling. And then, you know, how have we and you seen that we've moved past that for the too precarious worker? I don't know who wants to jump in on that one.
You go for it, Jamie.
So I think there's a couple of things to say with this, which is, you know, when we look at what's happening with unions today, there are obviously a number of shifts. You know, we can see this in England, but also in Scotland, in the US, and, you know, many other places, of massively declined union membership from the 70s, right? And I think some people make this argument that unions, you know, don't fit anymore, or, you know, that the work that people did back then was somehow like more appropriate to being in unions. But one of the biggest reasons for the fall in unions is new areas of work being established that unions haven't started in. And, you know, there's a really interesting bit of research that says loads of people would join unions if they were asked. You know, if another colleague talked to them and said, we should do this, right? But most people in Britain today, in Scotland or in England, aren't in a union and never have been. And no one's ever had those conversations. And I think this means that, like, when you look at it from the outside, you can say, like, oh, that group of workers are too precarious, or that group are too comfortable, or technology is too important in one workplace or another. But I think what it forgets is that we shouldn't start from the union. We should start from people organising together. And when people see that there's something that they can do collectively, that's when a union makes sense, right? Because, you know, elsewhere in society, many of the collective forms of things we do are disappearing. And it's about bringing that back, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Just to kind of add on that, this idea comes from, in the book, we try and discredit lots of inherited myths about unions, and not to, you know, be down on anyone who has these, because I totally would understand, looking at lots of the kind of current big modern unions, why people would think they weren't for them, or think they weren't interested in them, even people who share left-wing politics. But in the book, we capture these arguments that we've heard from so many different workers. You know, it's almost like we roll our eyes every time we meet a new group of workers, because they're like, we can't organize because of X, you know, something that they feel makes them so totally unique as a group of workers, and so different from all the other precarious workers or not precarious workers that have organized before and won. So by kind of tackling those myths, we're trying to give people the confidence to actually do it. And this, you know, myth of being too precarious is often one that has been imposed from above, from union organizers or union staff. For example, in the example I gave of the cleaners at my own university, there was an organizer from a different union who I'd met with the year before, you know, as part of a kind of student campaign. And I asked him about the cleaners organizing, and he was like, ugh, so dismissive, you know, don't even bother, you know, they're all from different nationalities, they would never work together, don't even bother, basically. And that kind of thinking has got us in this mess where we even think it's possible to call someone unorganizable. I think we just need to put aside any of that language or those thoughts.
Yeah, I think that case was really well made in the book, because it's so rich with case studies, and also so good at highlighting this a saying, I think the Glasgow Women's Library has it on a board, which is, you know, that there's no hard to reach populations, there's only those we don't bother looking for, like the easy to ignore. And it's sort of, who are we trying to reach out for? And it's been really exciting seeing over the last couple of years, specifically in Edinburgh, the rise of the sex workers union here, who has very effectively fought the nil cap in Edinburgh. But we're coming up on, in Edinburgh, the council's trying yet again, despite a judicial review that's ruled against them, that was brought entirely by sex workers. They're trying to challenge that again, which leads me to a question around this idea of the victories and the losses, what we are winning and what we're not. And we see a lot of headlines when strikes are happening, when disruption is happening, when the everyday person is, but then we don't get to hear who won, what they won, how they won. We only get to hear, well, things are still shit. So clearly the wave of union organizing didn't do anything collectively. And so I wanted to ask about that disjoint between the victories we have and what we hear about, and what our media, or where we're getting our media, plays into that.
Absolutely. It's a friend of ours we know through IWGB, an amazing guy, Emiliano Molina. You should definitely follow him online if you don't. He is an investigative journalist, mostly doing stuff about workers and unions. And he has this real bugbear about the lack of trade union, you know, industrial reporting in the press now. I think there's like a handful left. And most union reporting is done by, you know, business journalists who know all about business and writing from the side of employers. But all the time, you know, the media is getting stories about unions wrong, really basic stuff about the law or, you know, how organizing works, because we just don't have the journalists who are qualified to report on that. There's some really amazing new journalists like Polly Smythe at Novara who are championing this return to industrial journalism. But there's a huge gap there. And it's that gap we need to plug to reach this new generation of workers who don't even know what a union is, which is very understandable in the current climate, but obviously a massive problem. Yeah.
Did you have anything that you wanted to add to that, Jamie?
Yeah, I mean, I guess just one thing to say, which is I do think this current wave of struggles has been hard to see lots of big victories coming out of them. And I think in part this is because, you know, if one group of workers win against the government at the moment, it's going to empower everyone to keep fighting. And I think we've seen some really exciting things happening along the way. But I think, you know, mainstream media doesn't report positively on strikes in Britain, but I think that's sort of, you know, it's beginning to change some of the discussion around these things more widely. But I think it's also on all of us, right, to tell stories about things that have worked. And that's why the book has so many case studies, because, you know, when I'm organizing with people at work, you know, I tell them stories about what's worked elsewhere, what hasn't, because it's things people can relate to. So, you know, part of having so many case studies is to be like, learn some success stories and tell them to other people, find new ones, because it's how we build confidence, right?
Yeah, very much so. Tagging on to that, I think one of the things you point out in the book is that there's always going to be a pressure point that a company will have, whether or not that is whatever the disruption does. Can you talk a little bit about whether it's with individual case studies or like how people have identified whether or not it was reputational damage or disruption, or who they would need to actually work with to, like, how do we identify what those employer pressure points are that maybe work in some environments and not in others?
Yeah, I mean, this is a great question, and I'm sure Lydia has some things to say about some of the other examples. But I guess it's about trying to get thinking strategically about how we win campaigns, and it's about being clear that, you know, when you organize a campaign like this, there will be opposition, and understanding where that opposition comes from and why, but also understanding, you know, that there's not one strategy that will always win a campaign. You know, in one sector there are pressure points of one way, like, you know, there may be reputational pressure, there may be investors who don't want to see things, you know, getting more complicated where they've put their money in. And so one of the things I think that we've learned from some of these campaigns is, you know, you start building in the workplace, but you can be creative and find new ways to apply that pressure, because winning is important. You know, winning builds confidence, and, you know, also partly why we're doing it, right?
Yeah, absolutely. We always come back in the book to this kind of formula that our previous General Secretary, Jason Moyley at IWGB, gave us, but, you know, will be everywhere in the union movement. You know, how do we make not imposing the demands that we want more expensive for them than giving us what we want? So, you know, how do we create so much disruption that actually on a purely economic level, it's actually just easier to give in? And we've seen this, for example, at Senate House and University of London. Lots of members of the IWGB ran this amazing campaign where I can't remember how much it was, but it did get reported in The Guardian of like hundreds of thousands of pounds on private security, because there were just unrelenting demonstrations, disruptions, occupations, which all culminated in this amazing boycott, where there were even academics in Australia who were coming for conferences to Senate House, who were then at the door would refuse to go in and would refuse to engage in any kind of academic seminars in the buildings. And that kind of reputational damage was a really, really sore point for them. And that took a lot of like experimentation, you know, 10 years basically of experimenting, pushing buttons. Yeah, it's a long road.
It's interesting, that thing that comes up in the book about building the capacity to actually take part in the actions, that you have to exercise that muscle by doing and deploy the power as you have it, so that people get a chance to test being part of something, and then that gives them the confidence to do it again or do it differently. And both of you, it comes up in the book, learning from or having other movements or other organizing being sort of the wind in your sails for stuff. So whether that was around Palestine solidarity or the climate movement, that people are learning from different kinds of organizing. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how that's influenced what you put into your trade union work, and then what you maybe have taken from trade unions to other kinds of organizing or power building.
Yeah, that's a really, really great question. Because I think, often these things are either seen as being completely separate, or people see that you can kind of subordinate one to the other, like bring bits of social movements into trade unions and suddenly it'll be more exciting, or whatever it is. I mean, my own experience is getting involved in political organizing through Stop the War as a school kid. And that was those kind of early experiences of like a taste of collective power, that,
Right.
being able to do walkouts, being able to shut streets and do these sorts of things. But a bit that, with what Lydia said, that, ultimately Stop the War didn't stop the war, right? Marching wasn't enough. But I do think that sense from some of those movements of like what collective power can look like, when it's vibrant and exciting, and has kind of, it's not just meetings, it's also the cultural side to it, and the kind of expression of it, is trying to find ways to give people that sense of building something collective when you're organizing at work. I've spent much of my life in really boring union meetings that it's almost like they're deliberately designed to be boring, right? In a room you can't find, with an agenda that's pages long. It's remembering that people get engaged in these things because they want to change the world, and how you can kind of build those connections. But also, and sorry, I'm rambling a little bit with my answer on this one, but it's also that sense that the union shouldn't just be a place to talk about wages,
right?
That we should talk about Palestine in our workplace and the organizing we're doing around it. We should talk about anti-war organizing. We should talk about issues around oppression. That there isn't some kind of wall around the workplace where it's just pay, pensions, and conditions, right? The things that people want to talk about and organize around can often be much broader and take in those big political issues of the day, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think from our like community organizing as well, and from lots of the union organizing too, one of the huge and really important things that actually I take back to other activism outside of the workplace and outside of unions is the real emphasis on like building community and family within a union.
Right.
That has existed in the union movement for decades and needs to be brought back. We interviewed this incredibly interesting person the other day who had been speaking to these Black trade union organizers who'd been doing this for decades. And they said, well, in the 70s, the union was where you had your birthday parties. It was where you were every Saturday night. It was your social group, your family, your friends. And we're seeing, beginning to see that sense of community come back, but I'd love to see more of it and to bring it into other movements too, constantly socializing with each other, barbecues and big parties. We do have quite a lot of those, but yeah.
I think it's such an important point, and just that breaking bread together, and also those networks of care, so that when you are showing up for something, that the people beside you have your back. Them from somewhere other than a really boring meeting with a pages long document. I want to bring in from that one of the questions that someone's asked online that came from Jay, which was some trade unions historically have suffered from power plays within the union, which has disenfranchised the most marginalized of their members. What accountability measures are in place now to stop this, and are they working? So how do we get the right kind of culture?
Gosh, I mean, I would be fascinated to hear the answer to that question, and probably don't know it myself, but just can really empathize with the question. our own union that we've been involved in for a long time came about because they were involved in one of these much bigger unions and found as Latin American cleaners that the union, didn't speak their language, wasn't able to integrate them into the union structures at all, fixed elections against their favor, all kinds of terrible union practices, and everything that's happened in terms of GMB, like horrible sexual harassment and assault. I'm not enough networked with those people to know what's changed now, but I'd love to know. Maybe Jamie.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think this is the risk with the kind of, there was a time last year where it was really popular to say, like, just join a union. That just joining a union is what people need to do. And I think one of the things that we've tried to do in the book, which, yeah, hopefully this answers your question, Jay, is that, like, unions are also a site of struggle too. They have lots of different interests in them. The general secretary's interest is often very different to a rank and file worker's interest. Unions exist in society with all the, problems that society has. But I think what we have to do is to see that it's not the kind of, that we shouldn't either just champion or just reject what happens in unions. And instead, we should be arguing constantly for more democratization, for members to have more control, for there to be debates on these things, for processes of accountability, not just when there are scandals, but accountability for every decision that's made in a union, right? And there are plenty of examples in Britain today of, unions where the democratic process isn't delivering for members. And so this is, I guess, a bit what I meant earlier when I said, lots of campaigns, we fight the employer, but there's also the fight inside the union to make sure the union is doing what members need. And that's, starting with the workplace, starting with your colleagues, like, that's how we can build those processes that we can then take into the union to fight for more.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point. And again, it's, if you build bonds of trust, then you can weather those disagreements with so much more flexibility, because it's another human being, not just someone you work with at a distance with whom you might have a fundamental disagreement. I just want to bring in a comment from Sarah in the chat. So Sarah Bennett said, just a wee moment ago, hi, I think Lydia's point about democracy is really important. I think another reason for encouraging democratic practices is that people feel really involved. This is important because if people actually feel involved, then you have more chance of building an active group, which is the prerequisite for building a movement. And then to build on that comment is then Ash's question, which was, what are your thoughts on what is the right time to compromise base to management? It says.
Big question. That's a different one. Absolutely agree with Sarah on that as well in terms of democracy. It's so important and something that we're not considering as this active process enough. In terms of compromise, I mean, again, I think that does really relate to the democracy question. This is something that only you and your colleagues can decide. And often it's incredibly contentious because you'll be getting, people higher up in the union hierarchy imposing on you when your time to compromise is, or when your time to strike a deal is, that isn't in line with your own demands. And often without them being there on the picket line with you, without them sharing your material conditions, often they're earning quite a bit more than the average member of the union. Without them sharing those conditions with you, we need to be arguing that they don't get a say when we compromise and when we reach a deal. So yeah, it's hard for me to say without knowing any specific details when one should compromise, but I think that decision should be democratic, it should be collective, and it should be made by the workers in the workplace. And I think we can have those moments where we feel like we're not going to win anything, or that we're losing, or that there's nothing more that we can do. And often those moments come right before a victory. you know, that we always have these moments where we feel no hope and that we've pushed as hard as we can and we're getting nothing. But I always try and say to people, like, stay steady through those moments. And that's when the collectivity of the union comes in to support us, to keep us fighting. But of course, you know, as colleagues, sometimes we decide on a deal that isn't what we initially intended. But if we've really fought and we've campaigned, we have built a lot of confidence. And sometimes that's about building the confidence for the next fight. Right. You know, the best, most strongest unions are the ones that can have the ability to fight every year. And that means keeping morale, you know, keeping some money in our pocket to keep fighting. And that strength of the union stops our employer taking away everything that we've gained the year after. So it's important to think long term there as well.
Yeah, I mean, maybe if I can just add one thing, I think there's another bit about democracy that's really important. And I think, yeah, the question is you know, about getting people to feel like they can participate in things is a way, you know, if people don't have a say in action, like, why would they participate in it? Is a kind of important one. But I also think in our current moment, democracy can also play a really important role. And Kim Moody, who, you know, has been writing about the labor movement in the US for a long time, has this really important point that if we don't have democracy in our unions and in our campaigns, we're not going to find out from people what's working and what's not working. We're not going to find out about a new struggle that's emerging over, you know, some change in work where people are finding this innovative, creative way to fight back. Like, we lose track of what's happening without proper democracy. And so democracy is also about us being in touch with each other and sharing things and being able to generalize from the best experiences. So, like, you know, all round democracy is really, really important, right?
Such a good point. There's so many questions and comments from people coming in, so I'm trying to keep track of them as they come in and try and tie them in with what you're saying. One of them is maybe taking us out of already being inside trade unions. Phoenix is asking, do you have any advice on how to be active in a union or organize when there is no visible presence of unions in your workplace? Where or how to start?
Yeah, this is a big one, right? Because most people are not in the situation where they can join the union that's already organizing, go to a meeting and take part. You know, for most workers in situations that people are going to find themselves, it's going to be starting a union or having those first conversations. Right. And I think, you know, just having a conversation with one other person is a hugely important start. And I think one of the struggles that the labor movement has at the moment is forgetting what it's like to organize in these hostile situations where it's unclear what to do. And I'm involved in a project called Organise now, which is deliberately set up to help people in this sort of situation. So you can sign up to the project, and then somebody from the labor movement will get in touch, and they're happy to coach people over the phone, to have regular phone calls, to help you work out what it is that could take those first steps. Because I think the problem is there are no answers for this because people's work is so different. Right. But figuring out even the tiniest little collective step, this is the first way to start organizing, right? And if people are interested, yeah, you can find the website online, sign up, and get a trade union contact who can help with some of this stuff.
Thanks. Yeah, I think the book also goes some way to showing those initial seeds, and the idea that somebody who has no experience before. I'm thinking of the wonderful cleaner from Ecuador who had come to the UK, who went from not having a union to being at the front of the picket line and protest, and that journey that can be made across so many different barriers and boundaries to participating otherwise. There's lots of those in the book as well. tying into that is a question from Scott, which is, how do you think unions can make union action more accessible to disabled members?
That's a great question as well, and it really links into, how can we make our work more accessible to disabled members and then our unions as well. It's that dual fight that we're talking about with, rank and file action and workplace action. And I think this should be a really important factor in our rank and file organising as well, because as we mentioned with our talk about democracy, when not everyone can be involved and not everyone is able to show up to all the meetings and the this and the that, then we are losing our key leverage. We need everyone, as a point of inclusion and solidarity, but also as a point that we all need to be fighting together and taking action together. I think there's some fantastic initiatives within lots of unions, forming disability caucuses to really take on that fight. And often it just starts at our branch level. We often have lots of accessibility issues in IWGB on the disability side, but also we mostly interact with issues around language and language barriers. And we're constantly translating back and forth English and Spanish and English and Spanish. And that's a real conscious choice to invest money in having translators on staff full time. And there's so many other adaptations that unions need to be making and that they aren't. I've been really impressed that lots of unions are doing, having signing for their Zoom meetings and having captions. But there's a lot more to do. And I'll be really interested to hear back from the person who wrote in the chat what they think unions aren't doing and then what we can push unions on as well.
It's a good challenge to pop that in the chat, Scott, if you have any thoughts of things that are missing, or feel free to get in touch afterwards as well. There was another question here, which is to zoom out a little bit on the bigger picture stuff, which I think is, it all ties together. It's from Josie, who says, where do you see the interplay between the trade union movement and party politics? So if we're talking about routes to power. Big question. My personal opinion is that the union movement has been, way too close to the Labour Party for too many years. And I'm sure that that's probably felt deeply in Scotland as well, as lots of people not a fan of the Labour Party. And that has severely hindered our ability to do lots of organising. And part of why I think we have seen this, big strike wave recently is that without the kind of close relationship with Corbyn, perhaps, union leaders are all of a sudden having to have this more oppositional stance. Right. But we are seeing lots of union leaders not explicitly saying, but kind of giving this coded language of, hey, I know you want this demand, but it's our own analysis right now of funding and the economy that basically we need to wait for Keir to get into power and give it to us. And that is such a tendency amongst the union bureaucracy, which just frustrates me no end. Jamie, I'm sure you have more to add to that as well.
No, I think that's that's absolutely right. If there are any other questions, I know we're getting towards the end, so happy to hear more.
Yeah, so there are more. One tying into that is going back to Sarah Bennett, who asked, some would argue that the strike wave is over. So what are your views on this?
So I think this is a good question. I think the strike wave has gone through a number of phases. And I think, we're probably, at least in England, in the second phase, where a number of public sector unions have accepted deals, often deals but with below inflation pay rises or pay cuts. But I think in healthcare, it's continuing. There are picket lines at the hospitals around the corner from where we live in London at the moment. And there are also local disputes that are breaking out. So we live in a borough in London that refuse workers went on strike for a month and they won. And it's the second of these refuse strikes in London. So I think I wouldn't say it's over, but I would say the dynamics of it are changing. And I think one of the big problems is that public sector unions haven't been able to break through. And I think, what happens in schools and universities in the new term could see things being reignited. But I also think every strike wave leaves behind, it fertilizes the ground for new struggles, right? And I think, even if this strike wave is over, strikes are back on the agenda, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. I was talking to a university lecturer the other day, and they said when they'd been on strike 5 years ago, their students are like, oh, what's a union? What's a strike? And then when they went on strike this last academic year, every student knew what the RMT was, what a strike was, what a union was. So there are good things left behind, I think, to try and be positive.
I think there are two questions that come out in different ways from that. One of which is Noor's question historically. So despite all the work, Noor says, despite all the work that unions have done to make working life better for people generally, there seems to be a strange amnesia towards those things. Even International Workers' Day in the UK is called May Day and does not reference workers. Do you think this cultural amnesia is changing?
I think, I think one of the parts of this is our education system in general doesn't talk much about work. And when it does talk about work, it certainly doesn't talk about how it's been changed in favor of workers. And I think this also runs through in the media too, that I think this amnesia is not accidental. We're taught from the moment we start going to school, your route to success is working hard, getting grades, getting a job, getting promoted, maybe becoming a manager, that these individual routes to success are how you have a good life. Right. And I think, maybe part of the numbers of young people coming over to radical politics or getting involved in union organizing or other things is a sense that even on the enemy's terms, this doesn't work anymore, right? Mm-hmm. The only way you're going to be rich and successful in Britain today is mostly if your parents were rich and successful, and because of the assets you earn, mm-hmm. So that you own rather than your income. So I think part of this is, it's a deliberate attempt for us to lose our history, because if we don't have our history, we don't have those examples to point back to.
I think it's such an interesting, it's an interesting point to make. And again, it's also that one around both, you're most likely to be wealthy or successful if your parents were wealthy and successful. We're also seeing that in the political leadership that we have ended up with, and that we continue to see despite, from the same schools, from the same backgrounds, through the same pipelines. And there's a question here from Tara, which is, you say that waves build capacity. These waves of strikes are building capacity. Are they building new leaders? So if we could talk about leadership and through trade unions.
I think it remains to be seen. Mm-hmm. I think my hope for this strike wave was not so much that of course that there were huge material wins and gains, but that there would be a whole new layer of people who had never been on strike before, who had experienced striking and hopefully winning, and through that would get more involved in workplace organising and would become one of those workplace leaders. That I think, from my small anecdotal evidence, I think yes. Like, I talked to this amazing nurse the other day who didn't really know what a union was before a few years ago. Actually, in the 2020 BLM strikes, a fellow nurse and union rep encouraged her to go out on their lunch break from the hospital and participate in these BLM big marches.
Mhm.
And through that, she got incredibly interested in politics. And then when it came to the nurses' strike, her union activity went from, here to here.
Right.
And she is an incredible workplace leader now. So those people who were kind of interested, but, not as involved, I think it has turbocharged their involvement. That's my hope as well, being positive too. What do you think, Jamie?
Yeah, I mean,
People?
yeah, just to say something quickly on this. I mean, I think sometimes when we think leaders, we think someone who goes on the telly and
Right.
is able to do those sorts of big leadership.
Mhm.
I think I've met countless people during the strike wave who are leaders in their local workplace, who
Right.
have built a union, built and got people out on strike, developed other people. And I think that's what we really need, is not new figureheads who
Right.
who can say the right thing in the media or whatever. What we need is people in communities, in workplaces, who are building the confidence to develop other people. And I think that's really, really exciting when that starts to happen, I think.
Yeah. I think, it's interesting, that idea of leadership and leadership within trade unions and our political leadership also came up at our event with Naomi Klein last night, who was talking about Mick Lynch and talking about this idea that in a moment where the trust in politicians has dropped so dramatically, that plain speaking cuts through a whole wave of shit that, we've seen in politics and got used to in politics. And is used to obscure so much. So I'm feeling very hopeful by what you're saying, because it would be so great to see people come up through those roots and traditions that give an entirely different dynamic for why you're looking for power, why you're engaging with politics, who you're looking after, that we could really afford to see in our politicians. And in our leaders behind the scenes, as you say, Jamie. It's not all about who's the talking head on TV. We have just 2 more questions, and since we're not running off into the night, I'll chuck them at you for the sake of those watching. One of them is Christina, who says, how do we get over the awkwardness around wage transparency, and why is it important that we do?
So yeah, I mean, I can say something on this one, and then you can roll the dice on the last question, Lydia. So I think there is a very British thing about being awkward about wages. This is something that we're told is not a topic of discussion that you should have. And I think what we have to do is really lead by example on this. So when I start a new job, and I've worked quite a lot of jobs in universities, so I've had enough practice at talking about this with other people, but is to say to people, I've just been hired, this is how much my wage is.
Right.
Not to say to people, you must tell me yours, but to say, I think it is important that other people know how much we earn, because every time I do this at university, you won't be surprised, I'm sure, to hear I get paid more because I'm a white man than other groups of people who are working in the university. Women get paid less, Black people get paid less. And so it's about saying hiding our wages or not talking about our wages only benefits the person who's paying our wages, not any of us. And it can be a really useful way to start organizing with people. Just very briefly, when I first started organizing in the university, we did a bring your contracts to a meeting session, and all brought our contracts and found out that there were differences in our conditions as well as our pay. And that's a really easy thing to go back to management to say, why have we got different contracts if we're all doing the same work? But this isn't to say it's not awkward. It's horribly awkward talking about money, right? But what's more awkward is people getting paid less because of their gender or race, right?
That was a terrific and important answer. How British we are. The final question has come in from Sal, who says, how do you feel about unions and union members taking positions on broader political conversations, such as LGBT rights, Israeli apartheid, and other topical but controversial issues?
Is that our kind of local leaders, or kind of general secretaries and that kind of thing, do you think?
I think if it's we'll see if that pops up. But yeah, so if it was unions and union members, I suppose bringing an issue to the table to have union members vote in favor of a motion on trans equality, or I don't want to be putting words in Sal's mouth, but that idea of making those conversations a part of the issues, which I think you've touched on, Jamie, earlier as well. But
yeah, no, absolutely. I think this kind of connects to one of the core arguments of the book, that we talk about unions as a vehicle for not just fighting for like higher pay and better working conditions, but we're trying to argue that all of our kind of big demands, like around Palestine, around climate change, BLM demands, we can use the organising at work as a tool through which to achieve them. And because at work we're so closely interlinked with capitalism and we keep it turning, we can use that relationship to then fight for those much broader political demands. And I think it's not always done well right now. Like, I think we need to bring people with us, and where there's quite a low level of political education in unions, it can kind of come out of nowhere, and you can do this one motion and then it doesn't really mean anything.
Right.
But when we build that on our very local level in our branches, it can be hugely powerful. And I think we really should be taking positions on that, because it's also so interconnected. How can you represent members in their entirety when you're not taking a stance that we need to be protecting LGBTQ people at work, and that we need to be fighting for a trans person at work who's getting discriminated against. So yeah, I think it's incredibly important, and we need to be breaking out of that mold of, union is where I go and fight for pay, not where I band together collectively with my colleagues to fight for other demands as well.
Yeah, I think it's been beautiful seeing versions of that in Edinburgh at various strikes, various picket lines. And, there was one outside Waverley train station with the rail workers, and there was the tenants union was there, the climate group was there, LGBT pride flag was there. And it was clear that it was this two-way thing. It was you show up for us, we show up for you. We are in this collectively. And that then there's also learning from each other, there's building those connections. So I so agree with what you're saying, Lydia. Jamie, do you have a final comment you want to add to that one, or do either of you have a final nugget that you want to leave people with about troublemaking?
Yeah, I mean, I have a final comment, and yeah, I mean, Lydia, if you want to add on to it. I mean, I think for us writing this book, I mean, the best thing about writing a book like this is hearing all the experiences that people come to book launches, or you engage with people around that. It's a reminder of how exciting and important organising at work is and can be. But I guess the thing that we really wanted to stress with this is that, if you have been part of a political movement and it hasn't won, or you've been part of a strike and it hasn't had its success at that time, is about remembering the politics of the workplace. That work is going to continue to be rubbish because it's work, and people are going to continue to fight around work. That work isn't just about the thing that we have to go to on a Monday morning. It's also the thing that builds and rebuilds capitalism every day. And that even when we lose a strike or we lose a struggle, we're going through a collective process of transformation. We're learning the skills that we'll need to build a new world. So even if, you struggle to get people to that union meeting, or things go the wrong way in a vote, or whatever it might be, that throwing ourselves into these things with energy and excitement is part of how we get to a different way of organising society. It's not always going to be fun, it's not always going to be glamorous, but there is nothing like that moment of standing on strike with your colleagues. And planning what to do. There is that taste of how we could be organising things differently, and that's really what we wanted to get across with the book, to arm people with some arguments to help with it. But it's a way of thinking about and trying to do politics.
Mm-hmm.
Summed it
Yeah.
up nicely, Jamie. That sounds great.
It's a brilliant note to end on. And it's one that really comes through so much in the book, that you get to live and be part of that paradigm shift that is that you are powerless, that we are sold through capitalism, and it is simply untrue. And we can remind ourselves of that a little bit every day by being part of these movements. It has been a pleasure chatting to you both. Thank you to everyone online for your questions. The book is Troublemaking. It is available from the bookshop. If you bought a voucher for the event tonight, it is redeemable against the book. If you are too broke for a copy, or you have a community library that you think would benefit from us, give us a shout. We've got the pay it forward system. The code is on the website. Everyone who wants this book should have access to this book. It is a terrific resource and a tonic, and it just filled me with so many thoughts and ideas, and I'm very grateful to you both for having written it and put it into the world, especially in this moment, which leaves me only to say a good night to you all online, and if you had further thoughts and comments, do feel free to email them through and we can pass them along, stick them on social media, get involved. And thank you for that. So good night.